This is a series of presentation on weed management in pastures. I think a good place to start is to think about what a weed is. Are they good? Are they bad? And why are we concerned, especially in relation to a pasture? So our definition of weeds is it's a plant. It's a plant growing someplace that we really don't want it. Why don't we want weeds in a pasture? Well, one of the reasons is weeds can compete with our grasses that are desirable for a space to grow, for sunlight, for nutrients, fertilizer, and for moisture, and can put a lot of stress on the pasture grasses. They also can tend to deplete forage quality, dilute forage quality, because the animals, if they graze grass, we know the nutritional level, we know the protein levels, not necessarily in the weeds. And the last thing we need to think about is some weeds are extremely toxic to all species of livestock. So we have some concern about weeds in pastures. But another consideration is, are they always bad? Are weeds always weeds? So this orchard grass in this pasture is not considered to be a weed. It's what we want to grow. It's highly nutritious. It's a very good food source for animals. But if this orchard grass was growing in a cornfield, we would call it a weed. So what is a weed to some people may not be a weed to other people. Weeds have some benefits. In overgrazed pastures, they can help to reduce soil erosion. They can provide food for wildlife. They can absorb nutrients from manure, so they have some benefits as well. We also know that weeds like milkweed, for example, is incredibly toxic, a very toxic weed to animals that may consume it, but is absolutely necessary for the proliferation of monarch butterflies. So what may be a weed in one environment is not a weed in another. They're not always bad, they're not always detrimental. So I may not be able to convince you to like weeds or love weeds, but I hope that I can convince you that they're a good, valuable part of the environment, and you have to respect them for their life cycles and how good they are at surviving. We know that they're prolific seed producers in order to be able to survive. The black nightshade alone, one plant, can produce 176,000 seeds in a growing season. We also know pigweed, which is very common in a pasture like that, can produce 117,000 seeds. There's no wonder that we can have problems with these weeds in a pasture. We also know a lot about their longevity. We know that lamb's quarter, for example, is an annual weed that you find in the summertime, and that their seeds can survive 39 years in the soil. 39 years. And if you bring it to the surface, it will still germinate. So it's not surprising to think that an animal running around in here that skids, if that lamb's quarter seed comes to the surface, it can still grow. So weeds are very effective at doing what they do, and they're very valuable in some respects. So one consideration is, how do they get here? You know, right now this pasture looks pretty good, but I could find that next summer I've got all kinds of weed seeds in here germinating and producing weeds that I haven't seen before. They can easily move into a new area, but how do they do that? Well, in the case of a plant like this, which is milkweed, which I allow to grow on the farm because of the butterflies, but keep it out of the pastures, they produce seeds on these hairy-like filaments with seeds attached, and they can be carried long distance in the wind like that. So I could easily populate my neighbor's property with milkweed. I'm careful. The other way they can move is manure. People take manure from other farms, other pastures, and put them on a pasture. Those weed seeds aren't always digested by the animal and pass out with the manure, well fertilized, ready to grow and generate new weed populations. Birds are notorious for moving weeds into an area. Same thing, they eat a berry, the berry has a seed which is not digested, they eliminate the seed, and the seed hits the ground and begins to grow and produce a whole new population of weed seeds. Okay, so they're very effective at moving around. So why do weeds proliferate in a pasture? Well, the key to understanding weed growth and proliferation is to understand that as this grass grows here, it's taking the nutrients that it needs out of the soil for it to survive. So weeds tend to come in and begin to take over and grow when the conditions are no longer correct for these pasture grasses. Okay, and that can happen occasionally. Just by living in an area, a species changes that environment to make it less fit for that species. And I think that's across the board, and it's an interesting concept. So the weeds come in, maybe this plant needs a particular potassium level, particular phosphorus level. The weeds don't need that, so they grow better than the pasture grasses, all right, in this case. Okay, you're going to hear this a lot in these presentations. The most effective way of managing weeds is to keep these pasture grasses and forages healthy. Keep them thick, keep them strong, so they can compete with any little tiny weed seedlings that try to grow. And that's the key to everything else that I talk about in these presentations. I think it's also very important to learn that species of weeds differ greatly in their life cycle, and I want to spend just a short period of time talking about that. So basically the life cycle of weeds can be divided into winter annuals, summer annuals, and perennials. Those three are the major. There are biennials, but we're going to focus on perennials, winter annuals, and summer annuals. Let's talk first about what a summer annual is. A summer annual weed is a weed that lives 1 year, annual, 1 year. What that weed will do is start the growing season in spring as a very, very small plant that you probably won't notice and won't pay much attention to. But that plant continues to grow through the spring, and you're still not paying much attention to it. Midsummer, that plant is producing seeds like crazy. We just talked about the prolific seed production in some of these summer annual plants. By the time I usually get calls about weeds, it's August. These are cool season grasses. They stop growing in the summertime. They don't like hot, dry conditions. They like cool conditions like we have in early spring and the beginning of the fall. That's when they really grow. So in the summer, they're dormant. They're not growing, but these weeds are. And they're taking advantage of the fact that these grasses are not growing. And they're producing hundreds of thousands of weed seeds. And if somebody calls and says, what can I spray on them to kill them in August? It should make sense to you that there is no reason to kill these weeds in August. They're going to die anyway. They're annuals, they produce seeds for next year, and they're going to die. All right? And that's an important concept. You don't treat weeds in August and September that are annuals. You're wasting your money. You're putting pesticides in the environment that aren't needed. Okay? A winter annual weed is a little bit different. Basically, it's called winter annual because it germinates from a seed right now. September, October, those little winter annual weeds are out there. And what they'll do is they'll stay alive as a little plant under the snow in the wintertime and be ready to shoot up come springtime. Best example in a pasture I can think of is probably chickweed. Mustards also are winter annuals. They usually are not much of a problem for a pasture because they drop their seeds in early spring and they die. So they're not around in the summertime. And the last type of plant to really understand and get a handle on, I think this is one I get a lot of calls on, is the perennials, like this milkweed that I showed you before, hemp dogbane, horse nettle. They're all perennials that basically live from year to year to year to year and produce seeds. Not as many seeds as the annuals, they don't have to because they're not going to die every year. So the best time to manage those primarily is by mowing them in the summertime, and if you're going to choose an herbicide, late summer, early fall is the best time to control them. In the springtime, these plants are pulling all the food reserves up from the ground. It's like poison ivy. If you put something on poison ivy in the springtime to control it, it laughs at you and keeps right on growing. But in the late summer, early fall, when it starts to move all of that food from the leaves to the roots, if you treat that plant then, it'll take that to the ground and help to control that weed. All right, so these life cycles become very, very important in determining how to manage these weeds. And I'd like to introduce you to some of the resources that I think are really important. And I have copies of these in my house, and I keep them in my car. All right, so this one is called Identification and Adaptation of Common Grasses, Legumes, and Non-Leguminous Forbs of Eastern U.S. It's a great resource. It doesn't say weeds, because we already talked about the fact that what might be a weed in this pasture is not a weed someplace else. But it's got great pictures, great information about life cycles, all right, all kinds of things that you might find useful. I like pictures. It's got lots of pictures too. My other absolutely favorite book, Weeds of the Northeast. You can tell it's used heavily. I've got plants pressed in here, pages torn down. I use this a lot. And it refers primarily to those weeds that we're going to find here, with lots of colored pictures of the weed at different life cycles and weeds that are similar that you might want to consider. And the last one, because toxic weeds can be a problem for livestock, this is Anthony Knight's book on a guide to plant poisoning. It's my Bible when it comes to toxic plant identification, management, and symptoms. Okay, so if you don't love weeds, that's okay. I happen to like them a lot. But you'll have to respect them because they're darn good at what they do, and I hope that you learn to love identifying them as well.